want to brace your feet on the block so that you can use your core to row the boat. And short, fast strokes are better than long strokes because then you have the most power when your paddles are in the water instead of in the air. So short and fast. And if it's windy, you'll especially feel the difference. If you row too slow, you'll slip backwards. And so if you row faster, you don't even have to row harder, but faster is better. Sometimes if you really feel yourself slipping in the wind, you can alternate your paddle strokes so that you always have one stabilizing yourself in the water, so like bicycle. Like that. So you should practice steering and turning the tender before you get in the buoy field with an actual boat that you're towing. So there's different ways you can steer the tender more gradually in a turn or in more sharp of a turn, just to spin in the water. So the most gradual turn would be if you're rowing and you just pull harder on one side. So I'm pulling harder on this side and I'm turning gradually, pulling harder on one side or the other. The next level of turning more sharply would be to, instead of still paddling normally with your other arm, would be to plant the other arm as a pivot point in the water. So for example, I'm paddling and then I need to plant my left arm and turn with my right arm. And we're pivoting around a little more sharply. And then the last level, to turn the most sharply in the water, you can pivot in place in one of the tenders. Instead of planting your opposite arm, you actually push with your opposite arm while you're pulling with the other. So for example, I'm rowing, turning with my right arm, but now I'm going to be pushing. Again, actually pushing with my left arm to spin in a circle without even moving forward at all. Pushing and pulling opposite in the water. So if you're rowing the tender and you need to stop, what you can do is plant both oars steady, and you'll stop. You have to brace yourself against your core because you're stopping the boat with your core that way. If you need to stop really quickly, you push. But that's how you can stop on short notice. Rowing. Maybe I'll turn gradually, plant my oar to turn more sharply, push my oar to turn most sharply, paddle forward, get momentum, and then stop. Brace yourself to stop. I'm approaching the dock. I'm going to plant my oar and pivot on it. One forward stroke, and then stop. And we'll drift the next couple feet to the dock. Ta-da! Here we are. All aboard. So in general, when you're towing a boat, as a general principle, the longer the tow line, the easier it is to steer. So if you tie the sailboat really close, it'll be harder to steer because the boat is pulling your stern with the most leverage, so that's difficult. In general, as a general principle, the longer the better, but we're also limited by the buoy field having boats everywhere. So within reason, longer tow line is better. So then the next concept is that what we can call ferrying in the water, so like a ferry. If the wind is coming this way, it's going to be pushing your stern typically downwind and pushing your towboat downwind. And so if your goal is to end up here, as your wind is pushing you downwind, you'll have to actually ferry, which is sailing or rowing, I guess, at an angle, because then it's pushing you. So then you need to be mindful that if there's other boats that are all here in the buoy field, you have to stay really high up to account for the fact that you have to actually row yourself diagonally through the buoy field, ferrying. So the last consideration that will make a difference as you get a feel for rowing the tender is the water line of the tender. So ideally, here's the water line, your tender, here's the bow and the stern, and you're sitting facing this way, rowing. And when it's level, you'll have the easiest time steering because the boat is balanced. If you then pick up a bunch of crew and they all are sitting here in the stern, your water line is gonna look like, this is exaggerated, but your water line will look like this. The stern is heavy and the bow is in the air, and then the wind is blowing the bow around a lot more than it is the stern, and the stern is dragging slowly through the water, and you'll have a much harder time steering. So what you should do in this situation is get one of these people to either sit way in the bow or sit right in front of your feet so that they're in the middle of the boat, and you'll notice that it gets a lot easier to steer. Same if you look at from the front of the boat. If this is looking at the bow of the boat, if people lean to one side or the other, just like sailing an MC racing boat, it controls that affects the steering of the boat. So if people are square in the middle, then it's much easier to steer, and if your boat is listing to the side, it's much harder. So tell your crew that they need to put their butts in the middle of the boat. So one last thing you can do when it's really windy, first of all, know your limits and don't go out and get stuck in the buoy fields if it's too windy for what you can handle in the tender with a sailboat. Second of all, we have a second set of oars in the shed that you can borrow as long as you make sure they get back into the shed when you're done. So if you're rowing the tender with 2 sets of oars, here's the bow. So you're sitting facing this way, normal one person rowing, whatever. As soon as you get a second person rowing, then you're gonna have to coordinate, and it's a little bit awkward, but typically the person who's in the stern of the boat would lead, and the person in the bow would follow, and then follow their lead and still try and avoid bumping paddles, but it'll still happen. You have a lot more power that way.